The silence in the penthouse office was a presence, thick and cold as the marble under his work boots. Darius adjusted the tiny screwdriver in his hand, his focus narrowed to the delicate motherboard of the laptop. He was an IT technician, a ghost in the machine of corporate power, summoned to fix the tools of people who never saw him. Around him, the city of Philadelphia sprawled out behind a wall of glass, a silent, glittering beast. He could smell the faint, expensive scent of leather and something floral, a perfume that seemed to cling to the very air in the room, a scent of money and control. He worked quietly, his movements precise. He was a black man in his early 30s, tall and built with a quiet strength that came from a life of lifting things, both physical and emotional. His hands, dark and calloused, were surprisingly gentle with the fragile electronics. He wore a pressed blue work shirt with his company's logo, the fabric worn soft at the elbows. He was invisible, and that was the way it was supposed to be. The woman at the desk, Naima Vance, was the CEO. She was not invisible. Her presence filled the sterile space with a low, humming energy. She was a black woman of arresting elegance, her deep brown skin luminous, even in the harsh blue light of the video conference screen. Her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo, not a single coil out of place. She spoke in low, measured tones, her voice a weapon of calm authority. Darius had been in her office for 20 minutes, and she hadn't acknowledged him beyond a single clipped nod when he'd first entered. He was nearly finished, just a few more connections to check. Her voice was a steady murmur in the background, a stream of corporate jargon about quarterly projections and market synergy. He tuned it out, focusing on the task. Then, the rhythm of the call changed. Another voice, a man's, cut through, sharp and condescending. "Naima, with all due respect, your sentimentality is a liability," the man said. Darius glanced up. On the screen was a pale, thin man with a smug expression. Naima's posture stiffened, but her voice remained glass smooth. "Marcus, a community outreach program is not a liability. It's an investment in our social capital." "It's a drain," Marcus snapped back. "And frankly, I'm not sure you're objective enough to see that. You came from one of those neighborhoods. You can't just hand out money to every sob story that reminds you of where you started." A tense silence followed. Darius felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He kept his head down, pretending to be absorbed in his work, but his ears were ringing. He could feel the humiliation radiating from her, a cold wave that even the climate-controlled air couldn't dissipate. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was dangerously quiet. "My background gives me perspective, Marcus, not a bias." "Does it?" the man sneered. Then came the words that would echo in Darius's mind for days. The words that changed everything. Marcus must have thought she'd muted her microphone to consult with an assistant. He must have forgotten she was still connected. His voice, now directed to someone else in his own room, was a conspiratorial whisper, but the high-fidelity microphone on her desk picked it up with perfect, brutal clarity. "Look at her," Marcus murmured, the sound tinny and sharp through the speakers. "All that power, that title, but she's still just a lonely, bitter woman, playing dress-up in a CEO's chair. Goes home to an empty apartment every night. No husband, no kids. Who is she doing any of this for? It's pathetic." The words landed in the silent office like stones dropped into a frozen lake. Darius saw Naima's hand, resting on the mouse, tremble almost imperceptibly. Her regal composure shattered for a fraction of a second. A flicker of profound, deep pain crossed her features before being replaced by a mask of cold fury. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stared at the screen, at the face of the man who had stripped her bare in front of an invisible technician. Darius quickly snapped the laptop casing back into place. He gathered his tools, his movements suddenly loud in the suffocating silence. He wanted to disappear, to melt through the floor, but he also felt a hot surge of protective anger. He had seen her not as a CEO, but as a person, wounded and exposed. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He stood, ready to leave, to offer a quiet apology for his presence. But as he turned, he saw her reflection in the glass wall. A single tear traced a silent path down her cheek. And in that moment, everything he thought he knew about the world of power and success began to crumble. He saw not a titan of industry, but a woman drowning in a sea of her own making, utterly and completely alone. His life, in its quiet simplicity, was about to intersect with hers in a way neither of them could have ever predicted. Days passed. The memory of the cold penthouse and the silent tear lingered with Darius like a ghost. He tried to shake it, to lose himself in the familiar rhythms of his life, a life built on routine and the boundless love he had for his daughter. His world was a small two-bedroom apartment in a historically black neighborhood of Philadelphia, a place filled with the smell of his late wife's favorite lavender soap and the sound of his daughter's laughter. His daughter, Amara, was 6 years old. She was a whirlwind of energy and questions, her natural hair styled in beautiful braids with colorful beads that clicked softly when she moved. She was the sun in his universe, the reason he pushed through the fog of grief that still clung to him 3 years after his wife, Lena, had been taken by a swift and merciless illness. Amara had her mother's bright, perceptive eyes and a spirit that was entirely her own. Their mornings were a practiced dance. Darius would wake before the sun, the quiet of the pre-dawn hour a small space he kept for himself. He would stand by the window, a mug of coffee warming his hands, and watch the sky lighten over the rooftops. He would think of Lena, a pang of loss that was now a familiar, dull ache rather than a sharp wound. He missed her easy laugh, the way she could make even burnt toast feel like a banquet. He was a good father, a devoted one, but he knew he could never fill the space she had left. "Daddy, is today a pancake day?" Amara's voice would call from her room, pulling him back to the present. He would smile. "Every day can be a pancake day if you believe hard enough." He was not a great cook. His pancakes were often lopsided, sometimes a little crispy around the edges. But Amara ate them with a seriousness that made him feel like a world-class chef. She would sit at their small wooden kitchen table, her feet dangling high above the floor, and provide a running commentary on her day, her dreams, and the secret lives of her stuffed animals. "Mr. Snuggles went to the moon last night," she'd announce, her mouth full of pancake. "He said there's no butterflies there. That's sad. Butterflies should be everywhere." Her sentences were long, breathless, run-on streams of pure, unfiltered consciousness. Kid logic, Lena used to call it. Darius would listen, truly listen, his attention wholly hers. He worked for a third-party IT contractor, a job that paid the bills but offered little satisfaction. His days were spent in sterile offices like Naima Vance's, fixing the problems of people who barely registered his existence. He moved through these cold, impersonal spaces, a quiet black man in a blue shirt, his real life tucked away in the warm, crayon-filled corners of his apartment. He carried his grief with a quiet dignity. He never spoke of it to his coworkers. It was a private weight, one he managed by pouring all of his energy into Amara. He learned how to do her hair from YouTube tutorials, his large, clumsy fingers slowly mastering the intricate twists and braids. "I have no idea how to do French braids, sweetie," he'd confess, and Amara would pat his hand. "That's okay, Daddy. We can do puffs. Puffs are happy." His life was small, but it was rich. It was filled with bedtime stories and trips to the park, with the triumph of learning to tie shoes and the quiet comfort of a hug at the end of a long day. He never asked for anything. He simply did what needed to be done, for his daughter, for the memory of his wife. He had love, real and tangible, in a way the powerful woman in the glass tower clearly did not. He found himself thinking of her more than he should, that single tear a symbol of a profound loneliness he recognized. He knew what it was to feel alone in a crowded world, and from that moment he carried a strange, unspoken concern for the CEO, who had everything, and yet seemed to have nothing at all. Naima Vance's world was one of elegant surfaces and profound depths of solitude. Her penthouse apartment was a minimalist masterpiece of glass, steel, and white leather, a space that looked more like an art gallery than a home. It was impeccably clean, silent, and empty. The city lights glittered below her, a beautiful and distant galaxy she observed but never felt a part of. She had achieved everything she had ever set out to do. She was the black woman at the top, a symbol of success, an icon of resilience. She had shattered every ceiling, broken every barrier, and she had never felt more alone. Marcus's words from the video call had burrowed under her skin. Lonely, bitter woman playing dress-up, goes home to an empty apartment every night. The cruelty was not in the lie, but in the truth of it. She did go home to an empty apartment. The silence that greeted her each night was a deafening roar. Her success had been a fortress she'd built around herself, brick by painful brick. Now she was beginning to realize it was also a prison. Her upbringing had been a relentless series of expectations. Her parents, both respected academics, had pushed her to excel, to be better, to achieve more. Love, in her family, was conditional, a reward for performance. A 98 on a test was met with the question, what happened to the other 2 points? She had learned early that her worth was measured by her accomplishments. So, she had accomplished. She'd gone to the best schools, gotten the best jobs, climbed the corporate ladder with a single-minded ferocity that left little room for anything else. A failed engagement years ago had only reinforced her belief that vulnerability was a weakness, that love was a transaction she was bound to lose. Now, in her late 30s, she had a life that looked perfect on paper. She sat on charitable boards, attended glittering galas, and made decisions that affected thousands of lives. But she had no one to call when she had a bad day. No one to share a simple meal with. Her tailored suits were her armor, her commanding presence a shield. But lately, the armor felt heavy, the shield brittle. The IT technician. She remembered him, a tall, quiet man with gentle hands and eyes that seemed to see more than they should. She remembered the way he had gathered his tools, his movements betraying an urgency to leave, to give her the privacy she hadn't even realized she'd lost. He had been there for her moment of utter humiliation. He had seen the crack in her perfect facade. The thought was mortifying. And yet, there was something in his quiet presence that had been calming. He hadn't stared. He hadn't smirked. He had simply afforded her a small, unspoken dignity. He had treated her like a person. She found herself thinking about that small act of grace. In her world, people were either sycophants or rivals. Kindness without an agenda was a foreign language. The technician's quiet retreat was a gesture of respect more profound than any of the fawning compliments she received daily. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of something other than ambition or loneliness. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. It was curiosity. She wondered about his life, a life lived outside the glass towers and boardrooms, a life where, perhaps, things were more real. The thought was both terrifying and deeply, irresistibly appealing. She was a woman who controlled everything, but she was losing control of the one thing that mattered most, her own carefully curated heart. 2 weeks later, the rain came down in relentless gray sheets, turning the Philadelphia streets into slick, dark mirrors. Naima's driver was out with the flu, and her own car, a sleek foreign luxury sedan she rarely drove herself, sputtered to a stop in a neighborhood she barely recognized. The engine died with a pathetic cough, leaving her stranded in the downpour, the rhythmic thump of the windshield wipers the only sound. She was miles from her gleaming office tower, miles from her silent penthouse. She was on a residential street lined with brick row houses, their windows glowing with warm yellow light. It was a world away from her own. Frustration gave way to a rising sense of panic. Her phone had died an hour ago. She was wearing a cream-colored silk blouse and a pencil skirt, clothes not meant for a rain-soaked trek. She was utterly out of her element. She sat for a moment, the picture of composed power, and then let her head fall back against the leather headrest with a quiet sigh of defeat. A knock on the driver's side window made her jump. Through the rain-streaked glass, she saw a familiar face. It was him, the IT technician. He was holding a large black umbrella, his blue work shirt soaked through at the shoulders. He looked different here, in his own element, more solid, more real. She rolled down the window, a cascade of raindrops splashing onto the pristine leather of her car door. "Trouble?" he asked. His voice was calm, grounded. "My car, it just stopped," she said, feeling foolish and helpless. "Pop the hood," he said. It wasn't a question, but a gentle command. She did, and he spent a few minutes under the umbrella, peering into the complex engine with a practiced eye. The rain drummed on the roof of the car. Inside, Naima felt a strange sense of surrender. She was Naima Vance, CEO, a woman who moved markets, and she was completely dependent on the kindness of a stranger who had already witnessed her at her lowest moment. He closed the hood and came back to her window, droplets of water clinging to his eyelashes. "It's the alternator," he said simply. "It's not going anywhere tonight. You'll need a tow." Her shoulders slumped. "Of course." He seemed to hesitate for a moment, then said, "My apartment is just around the corner. You can come in, get dry, use my phone to call a car service. It's no trouble." The offer was so simple, so decent. It was the last thing she expected. In her world, help always came with a price, an invoice, an expectation of reciprocity. His was offered freely. I couldn't impose," she began, the refusal automatic. "It's not an imposition," he said, his gaze steady. "It's just rain, and you're soaked." He wasn't looking at her like a CEO. He was looking at her like a person who needed help. For the second time, his simple decency disarmed her. She nodded, a small, tight movement. "Okay, thank you." He opened her door, holding the umbrella over her as she stepped out into the deluge. Her expensive heels sank slightly into the soft asphalt. He didn't seem to notice or care about her designer suit or the aura of power she usually carried. He just led her down the block, the large umbrella a small shared shelter against the storm. They walked in silence. The sound of their footsteps, one heavy and sure, the other a delicate, uncertain click, echoed on the wet pavement. His apartment building was an old brick walk-up, clean and well-maintained. The hallway smelled of rain and something savory, like roasting garlic. When he opened the door to his apartment, she was struck by the immediate sense of warmth. It wasn't just the heat, it was a feeling. The small living room was filled with mismatched but comfortable-looking furniture, a shelf overflowing with books, and everywhere, the vibrant, chaotic evidence of a child. A bright yellow backpack lay on the floor, spilling crayons. A tower of colorful blocks stood precariously on a coffee table, and on the wall, taped up with the cheerful imprecision of a child, were dozens of drawings. "Daddy, you're home!" A little girl with her hair in beaded braids came running from a hallway, her bare feet pattering on the wooden floor. She stopped short when she saw Naima, her bright eyes wide with curiosity. "Amara, this is a friend," Darius said, his voice softening as he looked at his daughter. "Her car broke down. She's going to wait here for a ride." The little girl, Amara, looked Naima up and down. Naima felt intensely aware of her damp, expensive clothes, of her entire being, which felt alien in this warm, lived-in space. "Your shoes are wet," Amara stated with the blunt honesty of a child. She then turned and ran back down the hall, her beads clicking. She returned a moment later, holding a pair of large, fluffy, pink slippers. "You can wear these," she offered, holding them up to Naima. "They're Mr. Snuggles' dancing shoes, but he won't mind." Naima stared at the pink slippers, then at the little girl's earnest face. A laugh, a real, unforced laugh, escaped her lips. It felt like a foreign sound. She sat on the edge of the sofa and took off her soaked heels, her toes sinking into the ridiculous, wonderful softness of the slippers. For the first time that day, she felt the chill begin to leave her bones. Darius handed her a thick, clean towel and a steaming mug. The tea smelled of ginger and lemon. He had asked for nothing, but in the span of 10 minutes, he and his daughter had given her shelter, warmth, and a pair of dancing slippers. It was more kindness than she had felt in years. The weeks that followed were a series of small, unplanned intersections. Naima had Darius's number from the tow truck incident, and she found herself inventing reasons to call. A flickering monitor at her home office. A software issue she could have easily solved herself. Each time, he would arrive, quiet and professional, and fix the problem with an unhurried competence. And each time, the wall between them would grow a little more porous. She learned about him in fragments. His name was Darius. His daughter was Amara. His late wife Lena had been a painter. He spoke of her not with sadness, but with a quiet reverence that made Naima feel a pang of something like envy. He had known a love that was real and deep. One Saturday, her home network went down. She called him and he agreed to come over. When he arrived, Amara was with him, her hand tucked securely in his. Her sitter canceled at the last minute, Darius explained, a hint of apology in his voice. It's no problem at all, Naima said, and was surprised to find she meant it. While Darius worked on the router, Amara explored the vast white expanse of Naima's apartment with wide-eyed wonder. She tiptoed across the polished concrete floors, her small hand trailing along the cold glass walls. It's like a castle in the clouds, she whispered, her voice full of awe. But where are all the colors? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. Naima looked around at her perfectly curated, monochromatic world. It was a castle, and it was colorless. Amara, seemingly unbothered by the lack of response, pulled a small box of crayons and a pad of paper from her tiny backpack. She sat on the floor, her small legs crossed, and began to draw with intense concentration. Naima found herself sitting on the floor a few feet away, just watching her. It was the first time she had sat on her own floor. The perspective was different from down here. The ceiling seemed impossibly high, the space even bigger and emptier. Darius finished his work, but Naima found herself reluctant for them to leave. Would you like to stay for lunch?" she asked, the words feeling clumsy in her mouth. She was used to commanding, not inviting. Darius looked surprised, but he smiled. A slow, warm smile that reached his eyes. "We'd like that." Naima's kitchen was a state-of-the-art marvel of stainless steel she had never once used. She opened her cavernous, empty refrigerator to reveal a bottle of champagne, some artisanal olives, and a carton of eggs. A flush of embarrassment washed over her. Darius didn't comment. He just looked in her pantry. "You've got flour, sugar, butter. We can make pancakes." And so the three of them made pancakes in the gleaming, sterile kitchen. Or rather, Darius made pancakes, while Naima watched and Amara provided artistic direction. It was a scene of beautiful absurdity. The powerful CEO in her silk lounge pants, standing awkwardly in her $1,000,000 kitchen, while a 6-year-old instructed a humble IT tech on the optimal placement of chocolate chips. One pancake got a little burnt. Amara declared it a crispy treasure and ate it with delight. They ate at the huge marble island, Amara's small feet kicking happily against the stool. She chattered on about her school, her friends, and the adventures of Mr. Snuggles. Naima found herself talking too, not about work or strategy, but about the dog she'd had as a child, a memory she hadn't accessed in decades. Darius listened, his presence a calm, steady anchor. He didn't offer advice or judgment. He just listened. He saw her. Before they left, Amara ran up to Naima and held out the drawing she had been working on. It was a picture of 3 stick figures, drawn with a child's charming lack of perspective. They were holding hands under a giant smiling sun and a sky full of butterflies. "This is for you," Amara said, "so you have some colors." Naima took the drawing, her fingers tracing the waxy crayon lines. The figures were simple, but the details were clear. On the left was a tall man with brown skin. In the middle, a little black girl in a yellow dress, her hair in beaded braids. And on the right, holding her hand, was a woman with brown skin and her hair in a neat bun. Underneath, Amara had written their names in shaky backward letters. Darius, Amara, Naima. Naima stared at the drawing, a lump forming in her throat. This small, precocious child had drawn her into their family. She had given her a place. It was the most beautiful gift she had ever received. After they left, Naima walked through her silent, colorless apartment and taped the drawing to the door of her stainless steel refrigerator. It was a vibrant, joyful splash of life in the sterile white. It was the first thing that had ever made the apartment feel like a home. She touched the smiling face of her own stick figure, and for the second time in his presence, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. But this time, it wasn't a tear of humiliation. It was a tear of hope. The fragile bubble of warmth Naima had found in Darius and Amara's world was shattered on a Tuesday morning. She walked into a board meeting to find an atmosphere of strained, cold formality. Marcus, her corporate rival, was sitting at the head of the table, a position usually reserved for her. He wore a look of predatory satisfaction. "Naima," he began, his voice slick with false concern, "we have a problem." He proceeded to lay out a carefully constructed narrative of her supposed incompetence. He'd twisted the community outreach program she'd championed into a story of fiscal irresponsibility. He presented documents, charts, and emails taken out of context, painting a picture of a CEO driven by reckless sentimentality rather than sound business judgment. He was using her own compassion, the very thing Darius and Amara had reawakened in her, as a weapon against her. "The board feels your personal history is clouding your judgment," Marcus said, the words a direct echo of his cruel whisper on the video call. "We're concerned the company is at risk." The other board members, men and women she had known for years, refused to meet her eye. They were sharks, smelling blood in the water. She saw their calculations, their shifting allegiances. Her career, the fortress she had spent her entire life building, was under siege. A few months ago, she would have fought back with cold, hard logic. She would have dismantled his arguments with brutal efficiency, using her own arsenal of data and corporate weaponry. She would have been ruthless, precise, and victorious. And she would have gone home to her empty apartment, feeling even more isolated than before. But something had shifted inside her. The memory of burnt pancakes, of a child's drawing on her fridge, of a man's quiet, steady kindness. It had changed her calculus of what constituted a victory. She looked at Marcus, at his petty, insecure ambition, and she felt not anger, but a profound sense of pity. His world was so small, his triumphs so hollow. She left the meeting without saying a word, the silence of her departure more powerful than any argument. She went back to her office, the one with the panoramic view of the city, and sank into her leather chair. The life she had built was crumbling. The threat was real. Marcus could very well succeed in ousting her. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. Her first instinct was to call her lawyer, to strategize, to fight. Instead, she found herself calling Darius. She didn't have a tech problem. She just needed to hear his voice. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his tone immediately sensing her distress. "No," she whispered, the admission a crack in her armor. "No, it's not." "Where are you?" he asked. "At the office." "Stay there," he said, a gentle command. "I'm on my way." He couldn't fix this. This wasn't a broken laptop or a faulty network. This was a corporate assassination. But the simple certainty in his voice, "I'm on my way," was the only lifeline she had. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, the image of 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun burning bright against the darkness. She was being tested. The world was demanding she choose between the cold, empty fortress of her success and the terrifying, vulnerable warmth of a life she was just beginning to believe she could have. When Darius arrived, he found her standing by the glass wall, looking down at the city lights that had just begun to flicker on in the twilight. She looked smaller than he'd ever seen her, engulfed by the cavernous office. He didn't say anything. He just came and stood beside her, a quiet, solid presence. She told him everything. The board meeting, Marcus's betrayal, the threat to her career. The words came out in a controlled, clipped monotone, as if she were delivering a business report. But her hands were clenched at her sides, her knuckles white. When she was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Darius continued to look out at the city. "What do you want to do?" he asked softly. It wasn't the question she expected. She expected advice, strategy, maybe even pity. His question was different. It was about her, not the problem. "The old me would crush him," she said, her voice hollow. "I would find his every weakness, every mistake, and I would use it to destroy him. I would win." "And the new you?" he prompted gently. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "The new me doesn't know if that's a victory worth having." She finally let herself voice the truth that had been screaming inside her. "I've spent my whole life building this company, this title, this life. And I've never been happy. Not really. It's all just empty." Her voice broke on the last word. He reached out and gently took her hand. His touch was warm, his calloused palm a startling contrast to the smooth softness of her own. It was the first time they had touched like this. It was an anchor in the storm. "It doesn't have to be," he said. "Lena, my wife, she used to say that you don't find happiness, you build it. Out of small things. A good cup of coffee, a finished painting, a child's laugh." He looked at her, his gaze direct and full of a profound understanding. "Your life isn't empty, Naima. You've just been filling it with the wrong things." His words landed not as a judgment, but as a gentle, liberating truth. She had been chasing a version of success defined by others, by her parents, by society, by men like Marcus. She had never stopped to ask herself what she actually wanted. What would make her happy? The answer was surprisingly clear. The feeling she'd had in his small kitchen, making lopsided pancakes. The warmth of Amara slipping her hand into hers. The quiet peace of sitting in companionable silence with this man. That was happiness. It was small and domestic and utterly, breathtakingly real. In that moment, a quiet certainty settled over her. She knew what she had to do. It was the most terrifying and the most freeing decision of her life. The next morning, she called an emergency all-hands meeting. She walked onto the stage in the company's auditorium, not in one of her usual power suits, but in a simple, elegant dress. She looked out at the faces of her employees, at the board members, at Marcus sitting in the front row, his face a mask of smug triumph. She didn't have a script. She didn't have a PowerPoint presentation. She just had her own, newly discovered truth. "For my entire career," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I have been driven by one thing: winning. I believed that success was a destination, a title, a number on a balance sheet. I was wrong." A murmur went through the crowd. Marcus's smile faltered. "Success," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room, "is not about what you acquire. It's about what you build. It's not about being the best. It's about doing good. This company has become a place that values profit over people, ambition over integrity. And I have let that happen. I have led that charge." She paused, taking a deep breath. "That ends today. I am resigning as CEO of this company." A collective gasp filled the auditorium. Marcus's face went white with shock. This was not part of his plan. "I am leaving to start something new," she said, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "A foundation that will partner with community programs, the kind of programs this board deems a liability. I will be investing not in social capital, but in people, in potential, in hope. Because I have recently been reminded that those are the only investments that provide a real return." She looked directly at Marcus, her eyes holding no malice, only a calm, unshakable resolve. "You can have the title. You can have the chair. You can have this cold, empty building. I am choosing to build a home." She turned and walked off the stage, not to the sound of applause, but to a stunned, profound silence. She didn't look back. She walked out of the building, leaving her keycard and company phone on the security desk. She stepped out into the bright morning sun, feeling lighter than she had in her entire life. She had walked away from everything she thought she wanted, and in doing so, had finally walked toward herself. She knew where she was going. She was going home. She took a taxi to Darius's neighborhood. The streets looked different in the bright sunlight, less intimidating, more vibrant. She walked up the familiar steps to his building, her heart pounding a nervous, hopeful rhythm. She knocked on the door. He opened it, his face breaking into a slow, relieved smile when he saw her. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could see it in her eyes. She was free. "I did it," she said, her voice soft. "I know," he whispered. He stepped aside to let her in. The apartment was filled with the warm, comforting smell of baking bread. Amara was at the kitchen table, meticulously coloring in a picture of a large purple butterfly. She looked up and beamed. "Naima, you came back!" Naima knelt down beside her. "I did." "Are you staying forever?" Amara asked, her question a direct, innocent shot to the heart. Naima looked from Amara's hopeful face to Darius, who was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, watching them with an expression of deep tenderness. This was it. This was the real question. Not about a job or a title, but about a life. About belonging. "I'd like to," Naima said, her voice thick with emotion. "If you'll have me." Amara didn't need a verbal answer. She simply slid off her chair, took Naima's hand, and then took her father's hand, pulling them together. She stood between them, a small, powerful bridge connecting two solitary shores. "Now we're a family," she declared with absolute certainty. Darius's hand found Naima's, his fingers intertwining with hers. It felt right. It felt like coming home. He didn't say "I love you." He didn't have to. His actions over the past few weeks had already said it 1,000 times over. He had shown her love, by offering her an umbrella in the rain, by making her tea, by listening to her fears, by simply seeing her. And she in turn had chosen this. She had chosen his quiet world over her loud one. She had chosen warmth over wealth, connection over control. Later that evening, after Amara was asleep, the two of them sat on the small balcony off his living room, the city lights a distant, gentle twinkle. A cool breeze rustled the leaves of the potted plants Darius tended with such care. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted with a small laugh. "I have no idea what I'm doing." "Good," he said, squeezing her hand. "That's how you know you're doing something real." She leaned her head on his shoulder, the fabric of his shirt soft against her cheek. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of the night air, of his quiet strength, of a future she had never dared to imagine. It was a future that wouldn't be measured in stock prices or accolades, but in shared silence, lopsided pancakes, and the vibrant, beautiful colors of a child's drawing. 6 months later, the Naima Vance Foundation had its grand opening in a renovated warehouse in the heart of the community she had once been accused of being too sentimental about. The space was bright and airy, filled with art from local children and the buzz of hopeful energy. It wasn't a corporate headquarters, it was a hub of life. Naima moved through the crowd, not as a CEO in a suit of armor, but as herself, in a simple, elegant dress, her natural hair framing a face that was radiant with a joy she had never known. Darius was there, standing by a wall showcasing Amara's latest masterpiece, a sprawling family portrait featuring not 3, but dozens of stick figures of all shades of brown, all holding hands. He had taken a job as the foundation's head of technology, building computer labs for kids who had never had access to them before. He was no longer a ghost in the machine, he was a builder of futures. Amara, in a bright yellow dress that matched the sun in her drawings, ran between them, a self-appointed hostess offering everyone cookies. She had blossomed in the light of their shared happiness, her world now bigger, brighter, and full of color. That evening, the 3 of them sat on the porch of the small house they had bought together, a house with a little garden in the back. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Amara was sitting between them, leaning back against Naima, her small hand holding one of Darius's fingers. "Mama would have liked you," Amara said quietly into the twilight, her voice sleepy. "She loved butterflies. And you brought the colors back." Naima's heart clenched. She looked at Darius, his eyes shining in the dim light. He nodded, a silent affirmation. He had told her stories of Lena, shared photos, made her a part of their past so she could be a part of their future. Love, Naima had learned, was not a prize to be won or a fortress to be defended. It was a quiet garden to be tended. It was built not in grand gestures, but in small, daily acts of seeing, of choosing, of staying. It was the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to walk away from a hollow victory, to build a meaningful life. Family wasn't something you were born into. It was something you were brave enough to create. And the greatest success in the world, she now knew, was not to be admired from a distance, but to be truly, deeply seen and loved for exactly who you were, burnt pancakes and all. The world in the glass tower had called her lonely and pathetic, but here, in the warm circle of this small, beautiful family, she was finally, completely home.